the officiant had just opened her mouth to begin the vows when Trevor stepped back from me and turned toward the side of the room. Not nervously. Not accidentally. He did it the way someone does when they've rehearsed the moment 100 times and finally decided they're ready. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York fell completely silent. 400 guests, old friends, Bay Street colleagues, my carefully curated circle of cover relationships built across 2 quiet years, watched my fiancé walk toward the brass doors near the floral arch. His hand went up. The doors swung open, and in walked Melissa. She wore a cocktail dress in ivory silk. Her hair was pinned up. She was carrying a single white rose, and she looked at Trevor the way people look at someone they've been waiting for. Not the way you look at someone you're stealing from another woman at her own wedding. Trevor's voice was steady when he spoke, almost apologetic, almost. "I'm sorry, Kate. I should have done this a long time ago." The room erupted in the contained, horrified way that expensive rooms do. Gasps, whispered questions, the clatter of a dropped fork near the back. His mother, Barbara, sat in the front row with her spine absolutely straight, pearl necklace gleaming, the ghost of a satisfied smile at the very corner of her mouth. She'd always believed I wasn't good enough for her son. She'd spent 2 years making sure I knew it, in ways that were just polite enough to deny and just frequent enough to matter. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at Melissa even once. I looked at Trevor for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to see that he was already looking past me toward her, long enough to understand that this wasn't an impulsive act of love. This was a performance he'd arranged, an audience he'd gathered, and a public verdict he'd decided to deliver at the single most humiliating moment available to him. I unpinned the veil from my hair. It was handmade Brussels lace, chosen from a boutique on Bloor Street that I'd visited 4 times before settling on it. I set it carefully on the altar table, the way you set down a glass you no longer need. Then I picked up the skirt of my gown and walked down the aisle. Not fast, not shaking. Back straight, eyes forward, heels making exactly as much noise on the marble as they wanted to. The banquet doors closed behind me, the noise cut off. The corridor outside smelled like fresh arrangements and heated air. I walked past a cart of champagne flutes and a confused bellman and turned into the passage that led to the staff wing. I'd arranged this 3 weeks earlier, quietly, with a single phone call. A garment bag hanging in locker 12 of the housekeeping area, flat shoes, a wool coat. My assistant Daria had handled it without a single question. That was one of the many reasons I trusted her. I changed in under 5 minutes. The wedding dress I folded neatly and left on the counter. Someone would know what to do with it. The freight elevator took me to the underground parking level. A black Escalade was waiting, with the engine running. The 2 people inside weren't hired drivers. They were members of my father's security team, and they'd been in the building since 6 that morning. The woman in the passenger seat handed me a travel mug and a new phone before I'd even closed the door. "The hotel's internal camera feeds have been managed," she said. "No footage of your exit will circulate. The DuPont apartment has been cleared. All identification under the Aldridge name has been retired and the digital trail sanitized." I took a sip of the coffee. Black, the way I actually drink it, not the way I'd been drinking it for 2 years, with oat milk, because Trevor found black coffee pretentious. My father? Already at the property. He says he's making dinner. I looked out the window as the Escalade turned north onto University Avenue. The city moved past in the way it does when you're inside something armored. Slightly distant, slightly unreal. Like watching a film you've already seen. The drive took 40 minutes. Past the 401, past the sprawl that thins into proper countryside. Through the gates of what my father has always called simply the property. The rest of the world, when it knew it existed at all, called it the Whitfield Estate. 40 acres in King Township. An original farmhouse expanded across 3 generations into something that now sat behind a gate with its own postal code and a lane lined with birch trees that were almost bare in late October. My father was on the front steps when the car stopped. He was wearing his old Patagonia vest, the one he's had since before I was born. And the particular ease that people confuse with casualness, but is actually just complete confidence. He looked at me when I stepped out, did a quick inventory, shoes, expression, posture, and nodded once. "You're not hurt." "No." "Good." He held the door open. "Your mother is in the sitting room. She's been reorganizing the bookshelf, which means she's very upset." I walked inside and found Margaret standing in front of a wall of books she'd clearly been rearranging for the past hour. She turned when she heard me, crossed the room, and took both my hands in hers. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking. "I should have let your father run a proper background check on that family 18 months ago," she finally said. "I told him to trust the process. I was wrong." "You weren't wrong about everything." "What do you need?" "Dinner," I said. "And then a conversation about Holt Development's Q3 exposure." She almost smiled. "That's my daughter. My real name is Charlotte Whitfield. I'm the only child of Richard Whitfield, who built Whitfield Industries from a single mining operation outside Timmins, Ontario, into one of the largest privately held resource and infrastructure companies in the country. We are not flashy people. My father doesn't appear on magazine covers. We don't sponsor galas or name buildings after ourselves. We sit on boards, we hold stakes in things that matter, and we have been doing precisely that since my grandfather came back from the Second World War with $40 and a very clear idea about what land in Northern Ontario was actually worth. 2 years ago, I moved to Toronto under the name Kate Aldridge, junior graphic designer, tenant in a DuPont Street apartment, a woman with a quiet life and no family worth mentioning. It wasn't a disguise built for drama. It was built for a specific purpose. My father had been approached by 3 mid-tier Toronto developers about a potential infrastructure partnership, access to our northern land holdings in exchange for construction and project management capacity. One of those companies was Holt Development, run by Trevor Holt. The numbers were sound. The man was untested. My father asked me to go and look. I went. I met Trevor at a networking event in Yorkville. I let him ask me out, and then I watched. What I saw, over 2 years, was a man who was smart enough to build something and not secure enough to sustain it. He needed to feel like the largest presence in every room he entered. He took credit quietly and distributed blame loudly. He was charming when an audience was watching and gradually dismissive when one wasn't. Not cruel enough to justify leaving, just corrosive enough to do damage over time. His mother Barbara was the more calculating of the two. She'd been pushing for him to marry Melissa Crane for months before a wedding date was even set. Melissa, whose LinkedIn described her as a marketing consultant and whose actual career was a series of strategic relationships with men whose ambitions exceeded their judgment. Barbara considered her manageable. She considered me unverifiable, which made me a liability. The prenuptial conversation Trevor attempted 3 weeks before the ceremony, gently suggesting that any financial gifts from my family should be categorized as his separate property, told me the picture was complete. I made a phone call that night. Daria arrived at my apartment the next morning with a legal pad and a look that meant she'd already started. "How far?" she asked. "All the way," I said, but slowly. The morning after the wedding, I sat in the study at the King Township estate while Franklin Baxter, my father's CFO, walked through the state of Holt Development's finances on a screen at the end of the room. "Their flagship project is a 42-floor condo development on the lakeshore," Franklin said, pointing to a column of figures highlighted in red. "Press yields committed, construction financing through TD, but costs have run over by close to 20%, and their draw schedule is out of alignment with the lender's release timeline. They're bleeding cash on the carry. They've been quietly shopping for bridge financing for 6 weeks. 2 firms have passed. They're now in late conversations with a private equity group called Merrick Capital." I looked at my father. "Merrick's primary institutional backer," he said, "happens to be Whitfield Capital Partners." "Let the conversation continue," I said. "Let them believe it's nearly secured." I turned to Daria. "And pull everything we have on the environmental certifications for that site. It was a dry cleaning facility before the land was assembled. I want to know whether the soil remediation sign-off was thorough." She wrote it down without blinking. 2 weeks after the wedding, an invitation arrived for Whitfield Industries, a black-tie charity auction benefiting Sick Kids Hospital, co-hosted by 3 of Toronto's oldest philanthropic families. The Ormonds, the Fairborns, the Deschamps. The kind of room where quiet conversations between the right people move more capital than any press release. Trevor would be there. Barbara had purchased a table. The evening was to serve as Melissa's formal introduction to their social circle. The victory lap, the installation, the moment that made the wedding substitution official in the eyes of the people whose opinion actually governed their world. I RSVP'd. The dress came from a designer in Montreal who had been making pieces for my mother for 30 years and had never once discounted anything. It was deep forest green, not bright, not flashy, but the dark, quiet green of old growth, with a structure that needed no embellishment because the tailoring was the statement. The jewelry was a single suite of yellow diamonds, privately held, never photographed. I hadn't told anyone outside the family that I was attending. The car arrived at the Royal Ontario Museum at 8:15 on a Wednesday evening. Inside, the rotunda had been dressed with warm lighting and round tables beneath the soaring gallery ceiling. The jazz quartet was good. The Okanagan wines were well chosen. The room was exactly the kind of room where you can feel money operating at its natural frequency. Not loudly, just constantly. The maitre d' checked my invitation, read the name, and went very still. Miss Whitfield. He recovered smoothly. Right this way. My table was near the hosting families. I was aware, without looking, of the shift in the room when I crossed the threshold. Not dramatic. Just the particular reorientation that happens when someone enters who changes the meaning of where they are. I heard the sound before I saw anything, a chair scraping, then Barbara's voice going slightly too high. I took my seat and accepted a glass of wine. 20 minutes later, Trevor appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision. Navy suit. The expression of a man who had been holding a confident face in place for longer than it wanted to stay. Melissa was a step behind him in a blush pink gown that was perfectly nice and entirely wrong for the room. The kind of dress that announces itself before the person wearing it can. They were standing near the bar. Trevor was looking at me. Not the way you look at someone you don't recognize. The way you look at someone whose presence makes something very large drop suddenly into your stomach. Across the table, Declan Fairborn, 34, youngest of the hosting family, known quietly on Bay Street as the most formidable thing to come out of that family in 2 generations, glanced in the same direction and then looked back at me with one eyebrow raised. "Old acquaintance?" he said, low enough for just the two of us. "A brief one," I said. He didn't press it. He refilled his water glass and returned to the conversation on his other side, but I noticed that he kept the position that gave him a clear sightline to the bar. The charity auction ran from 9 until past. I purchased a group of 7 landscape that had been donated through a family trust, a piece that had been sitting in a Whitfield Industries storage facility for years before my father put it into circulation. I paid considerably above the opening bid. There was polite applause. During the open networking that followed, Trevor came to find me. He waited until Declan had stepped away to speak with the Ormond family. He approached from the side, the way people do when they're trying to arrive without announcing themselves. "Kate," his voice was careful low. I turned and looked at him the way you look at a stranger who has used your name. "I know what this looks like," he said. "I know tonight probably seems, I'd like to explain. About the wedding. You deserve to hear it from me." I set my wine glass on the table beside me. "My name is Charlotte Whitfield," I said. Not coldly, just clearly, the way you state a fact that doesn't need weight because its weight is already evident. He went pale, not gradually, all at once. "Whitfield." He said it the way you say a word that just changed shape in your mouth. "You're Richard Whitfield's daughter." "Yes." The silence lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, I watched Trevor Holt's understanding of the past 2 years quietly come apart, because he was smart enough, for all his considerable failings, to grasp exactly what it meant. Kate Aldridge, the woman he'd arranged to humiliate in front of 400 people, had not been who he believed. Which meant every assumption he'd made about the balance of the relationship. Who had standing, who needed whom, who was the one being accommodated, had been from the very beginning wrong. "The woman you dismissed at your own wedding," I said, keeping my voice at a register only he could hear, "was the daughter of the man your company has been courting for 3 years. I imagine you can appreciate why that creates a certain difficulty." He opened his mouth, nothing came out. "Enjoy your evening," I said, and I turned back to the room. Declan was there, timing that told me he'd been watching, and handed me a fresh glass with the kind of composure that told me he'd done a rapid calculation and landed on an answer he liked. "The Ormond family has a question about the Northern Transit Corridor," he said, gesturing toward the far side of the room. "Whenever you're ready." We walked away. I didn't look back. Behind me, I heard Melissa ask Trevor what had just happened. His answer was inaudible. Her response, a few seconds later, was not. Trevor, that's Whitfield Industries. Do you understand what this means for the lakeshore? The music covered the rest. The weeks that followed moved quietly, the way the most consequential things tend to. The environmental review I'd requested on the lakeshore development site found what I'd suspected. A soil remediation certificate signed by a consultant whose license had lapsed at the time of signing. An anonymous referral to the Ontario Ministry of the Environment triggered a formal inspection notice. Construction on the project was suspended pending review. Merritt Capital withdrew from the bridge financing conversation the same week. No public explanation. Just a returned call and a brief note about risk profile recalibration. The holding company's shares on the TSX dropped 11% across 3 trading sessions. Presale buyers began asking questions. Institutional investors requested covenant review. The morning Holt Development issued a press release describing the suspension as routine due diligence. The Globe's real estate desk received a document package. It was thorough, factual, and organized with the kind of care that makes a journalist's job straightforward. Construction overruns. The licensing gap. The bridge financing collapse. The transfer records. The piece ran 2 days later. Trevor's requests for a meeting with the Whitfield corporate office were handled by a courteous receptionist, who explained that Miss Whitfield's schedule was fully committed and that formal business inquiries should be directed to Whitfield Capital Partners through the standard intake process. Barbara called my mother. Margaret told me about it that evening. I could hear the precise quality of restraint in her voice that means she is genuinely angry. She cried, my mother said. She said she'd always thought of you as a daughter. She said the wedding was Trevor's decision, and she had her own reservations. What did you say? I said I appreciated her reaching out and that I'd pass along her regards. A pause. And then I said that members of this family aren't available for misunderstandings of that magnitude. I was quiet for a moment. Outside my office window, the November sky over Toronto had gone the particular gray that means snow before the week is out. Mum, are you all right? I'm furious, she said, in the pleasant tone she uses when the feeling is completely settled. But I'll be fine. Are you coming for Thanksgiving? Yes. Good. Your father has bought an unreasonable amount of squash. 6 weeks after the museum gala, Holt Development Group entered creditor protection. The Lakeshore project was placed under court-supervised administration. Trevor resigned as CEO the morning the filing became public. That afternoon, I was in a boardroom on the 38th floor of a Bay Street tower, signing the preliminary term sheet for Whitfield's acquisition of the Lakeshore site and 3 adjacent parcels at a combined price representing approximately 30 cents on the dollar of original assessed value. The land sat in exactly the location we'd been wanting for the Northern Transit Corridor project for 6 years. We would remediate the soil properly, which we'd always intended. We would develop it properly, which we'd always known how to do. Declan Fairborn was at the table as co-investor. In the weeks since the museum, he'd proven himself to be exactly the kind of person worth knowing. Direct, without performance, no interest in impressing people he didn't respect. Holt applied to Fairborn Capital twice in the past year, he said, when the papers were signed. We passed both times. I know, I said. He looked at the term sheet. Smart family. Shame about the judgment. I capped my pen. Trevor is capable enough. He just needed to believe he was in a room full of people smaller than him. I put on my coat. He wasn't. The rest resolved in stages. Melissa left Toronto before Christmas. Her father's CRA arrears became part of a public audit disclosure in November. Trevor was seen in February at a bar on College Street, looking, according to someone who happened to be there, and passed the information along through a mutual acquaintance, like a man who was slowly arriving at the full dimensions of what he'd lost. Not Kate Aldridge. Not the Lakeshore site, the partnership, the backing. The trajectory that would have taken Holt Development from a mid-tier Toronto operation to a national infrastructure company, which was precisely what my father had been prepared to offer him had he turned out to be a different kind of man. He had taken everything he had and traded it for an ivory silk dress and a white rose. I thought about him exactly once after February, and then I stopped. Easter at the King Township estate came in late April, cold and bright the way Ontario springs are when they're real. My mother had filled every room with tulips from the greenhouse. My father was doing something complicated with a leg of lamb he'd been planning since before Lent. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee and watched him work. Franklin tells me the lakeshore remediation is ahead of schedule, he said, without turning from the stove. 2 weeks ahead. Good. He adjusted the heat. The Deschamps family called. They'd like to discuss the Eastern Expansion Corridor. I'll arrange something for May. He turned around then and looked at me the way he does when he's checking the actual weight of things, not just the surface. Are you well, he asked. Not small talk. He doesn't make small talk. Yes, I said. And I meant it in the full sense. Not past something, not recovered from something. But genuinely, straightforwardly well. The way you are when you've been tested at a temperature you didn't know you could withstand, and discovered something reliable about your own composition. He nodded once, satisfied, and turned back to the lamb. My mother came in carrying more tulips and said something about the table settings that made him laugh, and the afternoon opened into the long, golden kind that belongs to old houses and people who know each other well enough to be quiet together. Outside the window, the birch trees along the fence line were just beginning to bud. That first pale green that appears before you're quite sure it's real, cautious, and certain at the same time. 2 years of being Kate Aldridge had cost me something, time, some comfort. A wedding I'd known for weeks I was going to walk away from. What it gave me was this, the precise, unambiguous knowledge of exactly who I was and what I was walking back into. Not a woman who'd been passed over, not a woman who'd been left. A woman who had stood at the center of the most public humiliation someone could manufacture for her, unpinned a veil, and walked out of the room with her back straight. Because she already knew, with complete clarity, what was waiting on the other side of the door. You don't need the audience when you already know how the story ends. The lamb was ready at 1:30. We sat down together, the three of us, and my father poured the wine, and my mother said something that made him set down his glass and laugh properly, and outside the window the birch trees held their pale new green against the April sky, patient and entirely unhurried, the way things are when they've always known what seasons is coming next.